Social insects are known for building some of the most impressive structures made by animals. This is true of honeybees with their curtains of combs, or of stingless bees with these helicoidal structures. It is true of wasps that make a large variety of nests, and it is true of ants, whose nests are not often visible from the surface of the ground, but when we make casts of these structures, we can see their size and their complexity. Among all social insects, termites are those that build the most impressive nests. And you may have seen already an example of these apicotermes nests, which are about 40 centimeters of height and on the external surface have all these regularly spaced pores. Inside the nest, we can see a number of floors that are equally distant from each other and supported by pillars. The different floors are connected together by different types of ramps, and in this video we are going to follow one of these ramps. I chose this nest to illustrate the complexity of these structures, but also the fact that they often have some regularities and that maybe perhaps for this reason they look beautiful. However, the structures that I showed are not representative of the majority of nests, at least of the nests built by termites. Here are some examples of other termite nests, and you can see that they are very chaotic. Here is, for example, a small fragment of a Coptotermes lacteus nest, with all this scaffold of tiny pillars that connect together in a very intricate way. Or another small fragment of another nest from Spherotermes spherothorax termites, where we can see all these tiny galleries that are more or less equally distant from each other and move around in all directions. Here is a visualization of the galleries themselves. Over the last few years, I've been particularly interested in the nests of nasute termes, which is a genus of termites which is particularly interesting because of their ability to make very different nest shapes, from huge mounds like this Nasutitermes triodie mound on the left, to arboreal nests like the Nasutitermes walkeri here, and consider that these are related species from the same genus and both from Australian Nasutitermes. One of the things that we see inside these nests is their structure, which is also very chaotic, with all these surfaces that connect together in all directions. I think that if I were a termite and I were to move inside these structures, I would probably get lost very soon. There are a couple of questions that we would like to answer about these nests. One is their function, what they are useful for, and the other is about their building mechanisms, how termites make them. Let's start from the function. I already said that these are very chaotic nests with a number of surfaces. When we look more closely at a single point on the surface, we will see that almost everywhere the surface have a saddle shape. That is, if they bend in one direction like this, they will bend in the opposite direction along the orthogonal axis. Now, if we want to think about their function, we need to consider that these nests are made by a material that is not very different from paper. They are made, in fact, from the feces of termites, but termites feed on wood, and their feces, believe me, are not too different from paper. And paper is a very good material. It's strong, but it has a problem, which is that it bends. This is what I call the pizza slice problem. If you have to hold a slice of pizza in your hands, it will tend to bend, but if you add some curvature in one direction, then it becomes much more stable. So by adding curvature to a sheet of paper, we can make some very strong material. And for instance, if I bend some paper like this, I can imagine that I can support a heavy load on top of it. Of course, the load can be supported well in this direction, but if I press along this other direction here, very immediately it falls, because it is not strong along the direction that is not curved. So by building structures that are curved in both directions, in all directions, we can imagine that termites make very strong structures. And in fact, there is a mathematical object which is called the gyroid, which is very similar, at least in appearance, to these termite nests. The gyroid is known to offer a very strong mechanical resistance for little weight, precisely because of the curvature of its surface. So in terms of function, we can imagine that this is one of the main advantages of building these types of structures. What about the building mechanisms? We could try to observe the building behavior of termites, but if you have ever tried to observe termites in their behavior, you probably know how difficult it is. As soon as they are exposed to the outside environment, they will close any hole, any gap in the nest wall, and immediately become invisible for human observation. So how can we address the question about the building mechanisms? One way is with some insight about the geometry of the structure itself. What we can see is that the nest is very intricate, the surfaces branch in all directions. And I'm not talking only about the nasute nest now, I'm talking more generally about many termite nests. They often have surfaces that can move in all directions, like the nasute or maybe be horizontal, like in the apicotermes, or they have pillars that can grow, like in the example of the coptotermes nest that I showed before. If you want to build this kind of structures, you need to have a mechanism where the structure grows at the positions where the curvature is maximum. For instance, if you have a pillar, you want it to grow at the tip here, where the curvature is maximum. If you have a surface, you want it to grow here, where there is the maximum curvature. So we can formulate the hypothesis that across a number of termite species, there is a general mechanism which consists in building where the curvature is higher. And in fact, we can implement in a simulation this. I'm not going into the detail of these simulations, but this is published already. You can see, we could see that by just implementing this simple rule, we were able to reproduce a number of features of real termite nests. But still, we haven't done any experiments. The problem was that we couldn't observe nasute termes in the field while they build their nest. But we could do something slightly different on another species of termite, Coptotermes formosanus, that we can keep in the lab in small petri dishes, and we offer them a number of features that have particular characteristics, in particular a certain curvature, for instance, so that we can observe where they build. And we can observe from these different examples, if we give pillars, they will build on top of the pillars. If they give them a wall, they will tend to build on the edges of the wall. So it's not just elevation, it's really the places where the curvature is higher. And in fact, this matches quite well the predictions from our simulation model, so in which we implement a growth based on curvature. But there is a problem. There is a problem because the top of the pillars or the edges of the wall are not the only places where termites build. They also build on the edge of this disk of clay that we provide. And here the curvature is really not so big. So what could be an alternative mechanism that explains this behavior? One thing that I should mention is that curvature is also proportional to another thing. It's proportional to evaporation of water or any other substance that could be included in the building material. If we think about it by common reasoning, we could say that evaporation is proportional to the surface area that is exposed. But in fact, at the spatial scale of termites, where everything is diffusive, so very small spatial scale, we can prove mathematically that the evaporation flux is directly proportional to the local curvature of the surface. But how can we prove this experimentally? It's very difficult to measure evaporation in this setup. So the idea that we had was to run the experiment again, but this time not to put any termite in it. Instead of putting termites, we put some salty solution, water with sodium bicarbonate, and in this case, the solution will start evaporating from the surface, but at those positions where the evaporation is stronger, the salt will accumulate and form some crystals. And so we can visualize exactly the evaporation. Here is the real experiment with termites, and here is the same experiment without any termites, but with this salty water. And we can see that crystals tend to form on the edge of the disc of clay and on the top of the pillars, exactly as the building activity of termites. So we can conclude that termites build, yes, in those positions of highest curvature, but probably they don't sense curvature directly, but they simply sense the evaporation flux from the surface of the material. All the work that I presented today is mainly driven by Giulio Facchini, who was a postdoc with me for the last couple of years. There are other collaborators, but I just prefer to focus on Giulio, who is the main driver of these experiments. And I would like also to acknowledge the funders of this research. If you have any questions, please email me or get in touch maybe at coffee breaks or any other moment. Thank you for your attention.